So I don't imagine many of you are unfamiliar with Otto and his work, but for those of you who have not yet met him, Otto is a multi-disciplinary consultant, a scholar, a teacher, a coach, and a coach known for his innovative work in social science methodologies and the revival of dialectical thinking. He's a complex systems analysis, and he's published extensively on enhancing and measuring thought maturity and vertical adult development, emphasizing their effects on organizational teamwork and productivity. Dr. Laske is the founder and director of the Interdevelopmental Institute, IDM, in Gloucester, Massachusetts, USA. He's been a lifelong artist, started out in poetry, and a composer of classical and computer music for 45 years. At 75, he became a visual artist working digitally. And many of you know Ursula, but some of you, I imagine, have not met her. For your benefit, Ursula's professional expertise synthesizes leadership development and organizational governance, addressing two critical facets of regulated enterprises. Her multidisciplinary background encompasses a doctorate in industrial organizational psychology, with a subsequent focus on adult development, and extensive training in governance, compliance, risk management, things like that. Ursula is an accredited coach supervisor and development principles for individual and group work in coaching, supervision, and consulting. So without further ado, I hand over to Otto and Ursula.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. I want to thank you for welcoming Ursula and myself today. Ursula and I have been recently working on attracting some other segments of the helping professions to CDF. And this presentation is also geared to them. So I would suggest that you forget about what you know about CDF and adopt something like beginner's mind. That might help you revise some of the assumptions you are making when using it, and it may open other alternative ways of using CDF. Thank you. So, Ursula?
Yes, thank you, Otto. Also from my side, a warm welcome. It's wonderful to have all of you here. Thank you to the Center for Applied Dialectics and the community behind it for having us here today. I'm a graduate of the European cohort. We have worked with Otto for this past year, and thank him deeply for bringing us to the world of CDF and vice versa. And it is also at this point that I want to acknowledge how wonderful it has been from the previous CDF cohorts to receive their support and how they have been reaching out, and also the wonderful publications that are the next generation of CDF that have been springing off from the legacy Otto has published and researched. We will be able to touch on some of that as we go through the presentation. And but if nothing else, you're welcome afterwards to have the slides. There's a master reference list with all the offsprings that I was just alluding to, and certainly Otto's publications. What brings us here together tonight, for me and for many of you in the morning, and for some of you quite late in the night, are the helping profession, and is with that also a profession that is including dialogue, where we are in dialogue with our clients. So I will very briefly share with you the talking points that we are going to have for you. Otto will start us off with looking at adult development as a topic in the helping professions. What are helping professions? and also how we are going to look at multiple dimensions. So again, here, those of us who have been in adult development for a while, let's put this aside and let's look at CDF, what it means, and at multiple dimensions. We are going to look at the metaphor of the three houses. That's a wonderful framework Otto has been developing and integrating, and that will be very interesting for most of you. Further, we are going to look at the architecture of CDF. What does make our work actually developmental, as in vertical? We are going to look at 3 dimensions here and close out with some practical considerations. Summing it all up, questions, so those will be the points. Otto, I'm handing back to you at the stage.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about the helping professions. I would like to start with Edgar Schein, who for me is the most knowledgeable writer on helping. He says helping is one of the most difficult things humans undertake. And also, second, in order to help, because essentially people can only help themselves, you need to understand that other person's mental process. For him, that was a behavioral issue. For us, it is a developmental as well as behavioral issue. The point here for me is to emphasize what I call internal conversation. I have always proceeded in CDF from the hypothesis that we are not only communicating with others on account of our own conversations with ourselves, but that conversation with ourselves is the basis of our communication with others, and that essentially what I call development, I understand as being based on these internal conversations. And in CDF, we get to see that these internal conversations, which are pre-verbal, but can be verbalized and can be tracked in structured interviews, are structured. They have a social emotional dimension, they have a cognitive dimension, they have a psychological dimension, and they have a spiritual dimension, of which, unfortunately, CDF at this point talks very little. So in this presentation, we will refer mainly to the social emotional, which we call ED, the cognitive, which we call CD, and the need press, which is a behavioral questionnaire stemming from Henry Murray's work as NP, need press. I will say more about internal conversations as we go. So I think we all would accept that the core of the adult development is mental growth. In CDF, we go a little bit beyond that, I think, because we adopt Elliot Chuck's notion that we are dealing with work, that it is work based on which we develop as adults, not only in organizations, but in the sense that every mental effort we undertake, whether in life or in at our workplace, is work. And Elliot Chuck's main focus and his, well, the deep thanks we owe him is that he was the first to define or try to define a theory of work. And so in this sense, I'm totally a student of Elliot Chuck, and CDF is a theory of work. What I have done is going beyond Elliot in including the social emotional, which he told me he wasn't interested in, and the psychological, which he told me he had thrown out as inefficient for consulting. So I've retained those that he threw out. Essentially, I think that's what I would like to say on this slide. The second main point for me here today is to stress that CDF is about job 2. Keegan made this distinction about job 1 and job 2 some time ago. And what he meant was that we have to distinguish, if we want to work developmentally, between these two jobs. The first pointing to the official role that somebody is hired for and the responsibility attaching to that. Or if one works as an entrepreneur, as I have done and you are mostly doing, then we follow our own assignments and define our own role. But that is not the focus of CDF. Focus of CDF is the interdevelopmental work that a role holder needs to do optimal work, to deliver optimal work, however that is defined. And that comprises not just learning, but it comprises the activation of the person's developmental potential, which is social, emotional, and cognitive. In my experience, most adults are quite unaware of the internal dialogue they are unceasingly engaged in. As I said before, this dialogue is largely pre-verbal, but it can be verbalized. And I think with dialectical thinking, one can make deep strides into understanding one's own internal dialogue, but also social emotionally. Now, this internal dialogue is empirically discernible through interviews. And we find when we interview professionally that it has a structure that can be unburied, that can be given feedback on, and that can be used as the basis of consultation and coaching and mentoring and what have you. So there is an empirical basis of consultation. Consultation with CDF can move closer to science and not just management science, which falls under job one. What is the purpose of CDF in this framework? I would say it is a framework for discerning and modifying clients' and patients' internal dialogue, the root of what hinders them from presenting with optimal functioning. For that reason, CDF is deep, both for the helper and for the helpee. And I will show in what way as we go on.
Thank you, Otto. In looking at the three houses, we are looking at a map or a canvas that is beautiful to use in consultation, whether you're a coaching, consultant, mediator, supervisor, therapist. It is a mental map, and we are going to look at that in just a second. Otto has mentioned that we work with different dimensions, mental dimensions, namely social, emotional, cognitive, and then also we are adding in a third one, the psychological dimension, yes. So the three houses, it's more of a metaphoric mapping of three mental spaces. It's called the three houses. You can almost playfully envision a visit to these three houses that you are taking your clients in and you engage. It's a canvas how you can observe where and especially how a person is experiencing and engaging with the different houses, one being the professional self, another one being the role, and the third one being the organization. This how becomes visible in how a client visits. In the houses, there are different floors even, so we can look at how are they visiting the houses, where are they gravitating towards, are they hanging on one floor or in one room even more than the others. So we are going to look a little bit at that. This is just an image. We are not going to work off that, but for you to see how it's going to present it in published literature. This is an integrated model that Otto has been integrating from different pieces in the management and even also the supervision, clinical supervision literature. And the names will likely be familiar to most of you. It's connecting as a mental space, the evolving self, the task, the role, the professional role that we have, and then also the organization. And we will now walk into the different houses and look at the different floors, and you will see I've recently explained it like a pop-up card, that how you suddenly are in a very different dimensionality in the dialogue and in the mental space with your client. So 3 houses, task role, that's where we get in for reasons of psychological safety. If we enter directly into the professional self house, that is from that perspective not as effective and comfortable for a client. We start with the task role, then we go into the organizational house, and then we enter into the 3rd house, the professional house. So when you are in a client engagement, often you hear clients rather rambling, or they are even stuck, they cannot articulate, and they have also difficulties externalizing their internal conversations. And the 3 houses, they give you that landscape and that space to have these conversations and see how the client is visiting the houses. Again, here the central question is, do you, client, know in what house you presently are speaking from? And again, here you being the practitioner guiding the conversation will also help to give a certain structure to that landscape here. As I said, using that map, the canvas of the 3 houses in a conversation with the client, exploring what they're doing. Starting with the task house, here we have 4 different floors, and it starts from formal authority to interpersonal roles, informational roles, and also decisional roles. So the aspect here is, what are the roles that flow from your present function, and how do you integrate them? That is the key aspect entering into the task house, and you can guide the conversation. Look at focus on role. You can have the client explore an objective view of the organization. Client can speak about interpersonal roles, contact, networking. How do they network with clients, business associates, suppliers, and so forth? Very importantly, describing informational roles. How do you distribute information? Do you openly share? Do you hang close on to information? Gives very important information. Decisional roles would be decision-making, direction setting, and leadership, but it's all task-informed. Then we would move on to the organizational house. We can visit that house. Again, we have 4 floors. Symbolic means culture. And here we can have the client look at culture, value systems in the organizational context, rituals, traditions. Moving on to human resource, fit between people's skills, needs, values, again, roles. Political means more, how is the conflict managed, power, coalitions, bargaining. Structural is the traditional organizational structure in terms of goals, roles, hierarchy. Then we would move on to the 3rd house in our conversation with the client. Again, 4 floors. We would look at personal culture, professional agenda, work context, evolving self, professional self here. So that allows looking at ethics and value systems. I'm moving through the different floors now rather quickly. I think it is clear how this gives you a map. And again, we are happy to share that. And that is a map, a landscape that you can straight away use with clients in your conversations. And it gives a very reliable, comprehensive spread of the dialogue map. And even more importantly, it does engage the client in sharing the inner workplace, the job too, in articulating that and externalizing that. So that is a metaphor. It's a map that points to the 3 mental spaces that we are also going to look at now as we look at CDF in the inner workplace. The inner workplace, and that is now very important, it houses capabilities. This goes beyond skills and competences as Otto said before, development, vertical, we are speaking about engaging the capabilities, training, skills, knowledge. Here we're looking more of a horizontal direction. Ultimately, it's the inner workplace that is the focus in the use of CDF in consulting, coaching, mentoring, and supervision. So we wanted to share this model with you as kind of an entree into a CDF and sharing more about that. It centers on adult development. Traditionally, the 3 houses are used in the cognitive assessments developed by Otto. However, it is suited to be used as a dialogical engagement with a client, and this is why we are sharing it here. It takes a holistic and comprehensive lifespan view by the houses, by the floors. That is what we are engaging the client in, and it engages the client vertically beyond a mere behavioral, horizontal, and psychodynamic lens. I'm turning back to Otto.
Yeah, thank you. I used to think of consultants and coaches as nothing but observers of how the client traverses the 3 houses. If you listen to clients, they habitually mix up all the houses. And so it's very sobering for them to be asked to speak from a single house and to tell us what floor of the house they are on. And then you, as a consultant, you have to listen to what you hear from them, social, emotionally, cognitively, and psychologically, simultaneously. Because if you want to be of help, you have to answer the question from what Keegan level is what I hear spoken? In what phase of dialectical thinking is what I hear spoken? And what psychological disposition might be behind what is spoken? So it is the spoken word, the developmental and behavioral listening that make the consultant be a professional in terms of CDF. So developmental and behavioral listening is the crux, not knowledge about management or how goods are moved. No, it's about this internal dialogue that is going on, and where is it located? In what house is it located? And what are the dimensions that are most prominent? We know that consciousness, or we assume that consciousness is a unified universe. So it makes no sense to distinguish and keep apart the social, emotional, the cognitive, and the psychological, and even the spiritual. We can't do that because what are we doing? What we can do is we can hypothesize that there are different dimensions. And that's what we are doing when we are speaking of levels and phases of cognitive development and so forth. But we should never forget that it's a mere hypothesis, because all of consciousness is always present in every word spoken. So I would think that this network of developmental lines that we have before us when we sit across from a client is presently a terra incognita, mainly because developmental science is too immature to separate as well as simultaneously link these lines. And that is a task of dialectical thinking as I have conceived of it. Next slide. So yeah, this is the picture of the dimensions we are talking about, the first 3 in particular. And it's just unfortunate that the science is dealing with vertical dimensions and horizontal dimensions have only recently begun to talk to each other. Let's move on. So here we come to the first dimension that in CDF is called ED, emotional development. And practically in terms of work and the three houses, it comes down to the question of what should I do and for whom? And so this question is geared to human agency in a socially pre-structured world. And the for whom is of capital importance. Let's go on. For whom means who is there beside of me for whom I'm doing what I'm doing? And when we follow Keegan and distinguish levels, we can make some interesting hypotheses about that. Because Keegan, I think rightfully asserts that all through life of a person there is a steady or constant oscillation between a focus on self and so focus on others. And that's what Keegan based his notion of stages on. This hypothesis that he followed. And we need to remember, therefore, that nobody is his stage. And as I will show later, stages actually say very little about a single individual because there are billions of people on the same stage, at the same stage. Now, what Keegan pioneered is the divisions between different points on this curve that has to do with where is a person at a particular moment in time that we talk to them or they reflect on themselves on this curve. And it could be that the person is in the middle and has no idea where the outer curve is actually located. But helpfully, Keegan has made distinctions that from interviews we can use in interviews, not to share with clients, but to let them know what is our view of their developmental level. In our work, we are dealing with stages 2 to 5. And what you see here is as a person comes out of teenage, which is instrumentalist in the sense that teenagers consider other people as instrument of their need gratification. They then become socialized in the sense that they become members of a group and actually become helpless if the group kicks them out. They don't know who they are if they lose their group. And from there on, some of us move on about, I don't know, 25% maybe of people to being self-authoring in the sense that we are people who embody their own value system. And so when we berate what is going on in the world, we berate ourselves because we know it is our doing that makes the world be what it is like, at least to a large extent. And only very few of us, 7 or 8%, make it to self-aware. Susan Greuter went a little bit beyond that, but essentially we are in the same domain here, where a person arrives at a point where they humble themselves to viewing themselves as primus inter pares, where the others are needed almost like in group on level 3. Are needed as helpers to sustain one's own integrity. So when we speak of what actually does the question, what should I do and for whom looks like, here under orientation you find listed those consulting issues, at least in terms of job 2, that we follow as developmental consultants. For instance, we know from our social emotional work that the view of others changes dramatically over a person's developmental journey. from looking at others as instrument of their need gratification to being needed to contribute to one's own self-image, to being a collaborator, and to being a contributor to one's own integrity. And that correlates with a level of self-insight that moves, at least hypothetically, from low to moderate to high to very high. So this is very schematic, but it gives you an idea what socially emotionally development practically actually looks like. Or take need of control, or take communication. Most people never get to self-aware communication. It's all about other-dependent communication that we are dealing with. So we can go back to the slide before. No? So the social emotional has very, very clear, observable, screenable, practical consequences. And that's what we are concerned with in CDF. So let's think about what are the practical consequences of assuming levels. We can help people develop introspection or insight into their internal conversations, depending on our knowledge at what level they are, from what level they are speaking to us. And we know, therefore, also that they need different kinds of support. And we also know, which is not known to whom we are talking to most of the time, that people are subject to their own mental growth. They're not in control of it. So we don't need motivation to develop. We are organisms that are constitutively motivated to develop. The whole issue of motivations and organization is a pure fiction. We know that external support, or we count on external support being helpful. Yeah, I think we can move on. So there are many, many practical consequences from the abstract notions Keegan has introduced, far beyond what he envisioned. Let's go on. So to recap, we have two dimensions to deal with if it comes to development. The vertical one, that is social, emotional, and cognitive in CDF, and the learning or horizontal one, which is represented by Need Press. And they are not at present dealing or communicating too well with each other in the literature marketplace. CDF is based on, or is focused on, job 2, and can really be used only if job 2, the existence of job 2 is organizationally acknowledged in order for it to be nurtured. And if you get into an environment in which job 2 is not organizationally acknowledged, you have only two options: to leave or to create that environment. So that would be my take. Thank you.
So
yes, thank you. It is a very subtle and important point. I think, yeah, let me think about that. Thank you for your very good question. We think we know what dialogue is, but if we also focus on internal dialogue, that notion is expanded because then dialogue becomes the dialogue between two internal dialogues that are to some extent externalized and to some extent remain hidden, because in speaking you can always choose how much of yourself you want to hide. You don't have to lie, but you can hide 3/4 of yourself, even in dialogue. True communication, a model for that would be how a couple talks to itself intimately, not only in the bedroom but outside of it as well, such that one party can challenge the other as to its authenticity and its truthfulness. And that is rare in teams. I think you will agree, Rod?
I would.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm sure this is only a very partial answer. Is there anything you would want me to add at this point?
No, your description reminds me of something that Edgar Schein put in one of his most recent books, in Humble Inquiry. And
Yes.
he spoke about he uses a numerical approach, and he has like a level 3 relationship, which is it is getting very close, I think, in my mind, to the same area of true communication, intimacy, but not as you say, not in the bedroom. It's an intimate communication, a truthful conversation.
Yes, thank you. I think Edgar Schein has spoken most truthfully about helping in all of its forms.
Mm.
And he actually once told me that if he gets a call from a client who wants to work with him, he will gauge at what level the client is aware of the many dimensions of communication, of dialogue, and he will only accept the client engagement if he feels, and he could afford to do that, of course, if he feels that the client is more or less close to his own level. I have a very sober answer to that. I think we are talking about a philosophical question that is beyond this framework that we are talking about. I can only tell you 2 years ago, I began to do spiritual interviews. I called them spiritual because I developed prompt for them following a Keegan example. And they are largely still unexplored. But what I found is that whatever somebody says about his spiritual life is so incredibly, is so much of a merger of social, emotional, cognitive, and psychological issues of the person that before you understand those three, you don't really have a clear understanding of what the person calls spiritual. So it's a humongous task to research spirituality on the basis of CDF. You would have to be a real expert in CDF as a practitioner then to approach spiritual questions and what would be more, even if it's in a work environment, to give feedback or to, I wouldn't even use the term mentor, but be in conversation with that person on a spiritual level about the work they are doing. So thank you for asking the question, but I cannot answer it in this framework. But I know that CDF would, or I would suggest that CDF would be a good basis for spiritual research or into spirituality because it combines those dimensions that spirituality is built upon. And I remember Wilbur saying spirituality, a child can be spiritual. So the question, when does spirituality start, is also a question we can't really fully answer. Whether it is there from the beginning, which I would assume, it comes to light only gradually. That would be my answer. defines success for you? I heard you say that in promotion, people are promoted according to their competences and skills and their practical success in the company, working with teams and individuals and so forth. And when trying to integrate a social emotional element into the promotional process, did I understand that correctly? What would you do? I'm reminded that in our book, or two books together, Jan, we have given an example of people who are promoted from one position to another, going from one country to another, and having been successful in country A, they fail in country B, despite their expertises. And they fail most likely in terms of their maturity level, social, emotional, and cognitive. So it is there that I think what needs to be introduced into an organizational culture is that promotion is an issue of job two and not job one. And however you do that, I think you can, if you know CDF, teach people who work on promotion and think about promotion, what it means to integrate level of development into their profile of the person they want to promote. This is not a real. Thank you.
Kind of a process.
Yeah, I understand you now. I think we are dealing with a cultural issue. You indeed have to sensitize the people you're working with, the team, to the developmental diversity in the team, which makes working with teams so hard, especially since people don't know their own level and don't want to know their own level. But before there is an understanding of how development shows up in a team, namely in a diversity, a group of people that's either upwardly or downwardly divided, you cannot introduce social emotional or maturity issue into the debate about promotion, I think. So for me, the work with teams and the work with issues of promotion really hangs together. They're connected. You know, teams, I think, need to be conceived of differently than they are now. They're not just a group of people. They are a network of developmental levels that structurally some lines in that network or some nodes in that network are given prominence over others, which totally distorts the real developmental landscape of the team. And so, you know, I think based on an analysis, a developmental analysis of the team, one could do that. I'm sure you have done that or thought about that. Would you agree?
We have been looking at several dimensions. We are moving on now to the second one. Having looked at the social emotional, we are now moving to the cognitive. We have several from the Suzanne Cook-Breuder cohort with us today. So here you will see that what Otto has been linking, but also separating with social emotional and the cognitive development. So the fundamental question here is, what can I do and what are my options? that is the question that is related to the mental work, fundamental to CDF. And the question regards the cognitive sense making. CDF comprises, and that we will go very quickly through the slide. Also, I'm conscious of time, and we will also revisit some of that we are looking at here. Very delighted to have Michael Besiches with us. So I hope, Michael, you will also chime in as we go through this part, and many of the others who have been engaged very much in dialectical thinking here. DTF addresses, again, we are with structure of the mental work or thinking. We are looking at dialogue in real time. So we are not looking at levels of logical thinking as we see it in other cognitive research. And DTF puts forth that human consciousness progresses through 4 eras, not stages, not levels, eras as in phases through cognitive development. Again, we are going to look at that in just a moment, knowing we are starting to go a little bit on the gas here, but hoping we can visit enough so it can land for you. Our minds turn dialectical when we are crossing from scientific understanding. So you see this is one of the 2 eras above, to reason, which comprises understanding as one of its moments. But our minds turn dialectical when we move from logic into deep thinking. So this is a visual where we can explain that a little bit, the cognitive development. We have rational logic on the left. When we move into dialectical, deep thinking on the right, common sense. That is basically the era we are born into. And it's void of any sense of conflict, focuses on the here and now, very tangible. It tends to overlook contradictions, or if they are recognized, then they are not necessarily seen as problematic. Moving into the era of understanding, that's also the basis for scientific work, increased use, unconscious, albeit unconscious use of abstractions. Here we already have a firm grasp of conflict and opposition. We can separate one thing from another, A from not A. And we are managing contradictions through formal logic. And again, here, as we are in the more of a closed system, that's also a limited way in what we are looking at here. Reason transcends formal logic by embracing negativity. Negativity in the sense of absence. Not there anymore, not there yet. We work with contradictions. We view them as essential, and essential especially for intellectual mental growth. We acknowledge a broader totality in the form of reconciling opposing concepts, both our ability to perceive and work with what is not there, it's rather than just what is present. We start to understand transformation rather than just change from here to there. Lastly, practical wisdom, where dialectical thinking becomes almost second nature, emphasizes insights and awareness, uncertainty, and also the paradoxical nature of reality. We integrate rationality and intuition. Here, when we look at real-world meta-systemic issues and decision-making, that's when we are in the deep thinking. In the dialectical, what I have marked here as the pink sandbox. Michael, you are here. Do you want to share a little bit your wisdom? Pleasure to have you here. Michael Besiches.
Well, thank you, Ursula. It's great to be here with all of you. But I also really appreciated Otto's invitation at the beginning to enter beginner's mind. So, which Jan's question before really triggered, and whether that leads to some understanding about further understanding about the nature of dialectical thinking. I don't know if it will. But when he asked his question, I was thinking, what would it be like to be part of an organization in which I knew I was being evaluated on my job to work? And what would be pleasant about that, and what would be unpleasant about that? And certainly the unpleasant parts, I would fear that some leader viewed himself or herself as the expert on how someone should be doing job two. But then I thought lately, I've been doing a lot of work with conflict transformation. It's become a kind of central interest of mine, and in a kind of worldwide alliance, I've sort of been involved in what's called the Conflict Transformation Service Circle, where we try to provide support when a conflict within this huge informal organization develops. And it seems to me that how people deal with conflict and is a place where they come up against socio-emotional limits, cognitive limits, need press limits. And if I was told that, in this organization, we expect conflicts to be inevitable, and one of the things we look at is people's repertoires for dealing with conflict and hoping that those repertoires expand. I was just wondering if that might be a means of sort of understanding, getting at job two being an important part of the promotion evaluation without it seeming to be subjective or arbitrary or requiring some dialectical thinking researcher to come in and evaluate, but just to look at, focus on situations of conflict, which I do think are inevitable, and begin to define what are the skills that allow one to deepen, and I think this would depend on dialectical thinking a lot, to kind of deepen and make more constructive the work on conflict.
I would like Otto to speak a little bit about complexity, handling abilities, the 28 thought forms based on Michael, who is today with us, dialectical schemata.
Yes, gladly. I would say first that the marriage of Berskine and Michael Basish's work is an unhappy one, or at least one should say an incomplete one. In that Roy Berska's moments of dialectic are an ontological supposition, whereas Michael's work is on strictly epistemological issues. There is a 2000 or longer back and forth in Western philosophy between ontology and epistemology. And we cannot deal with that here in any way. I would therefore rather say something about why Berska's work attracted me and what it meant for me or means for me in working with CDF. I think it is about critical realism in the sense that if I speak and if I think, I need to acknowledge that there is a pre-structured social and physical world there outside of me that I am a product of and I am conditioned by. And so in the end, dialectical thinking cannot be strictly an epistemological issue. especially if with Margaret Archer you think of thinking as being an expression of agency. Because if you do so, and Margaret Archer, the sociologist, has with great detail unfolded Bhaskara's work for its importance in the social sciences. The not opposition, but the relationship between ontology and epistemology, ultimately in social sciences comes down to the fact that the agent who is thinking is already confronted by a pre-structured social reality that he needs to know about, and that as he is thinking needs to take into account cognitively, if not also socially, emotionally, and psychologically. And I would hope that in the end, what is taught as dialectical thinking would be aware of this link with social reality, that the thinker is a very dependent, deeply pre-structured animal that needs to be understood before his or her thinking can be understood. And so the research that is missing, that is lacking, is this connection between how thinking in specific sociological and social circumstances functions and can be developed to function more optimally. So dialectic is not for me an epistemological issue only. It is an issue of connecting how we deal with people's thinking as consultants to our clients' awareness of the social world as conditioning what they are doing, far beyond the organizational context that they just barely understand.
And here I would like to point Eva Vodelia, who is on the call with us today, and Otto. They have been putting a very, very helpful handbook together with wonderful mind-opening questions. There are other fantastic publications. Graham Boyd and his authoring partner Jack, they have put a wonderful book together called Rebuild, where they detail and explain wonderfully how we can learn dialectical thinking by engaging in thought forms, by learning the 28 thought forms, and developing the capability to see them structured in dialogues. Here again, we mentioned several publications. Here is a triple suite. I should call it a sweep that Otto published last year on the topic, and Japanese publication imminent. So there are lots of resources.
First, I want to endorse the importance of what Eva has done with the handbook. The handbook of dialectical thought forms, which is her work, is a very, it's the most important, for me, most important practical support for working with people and organizations. So congratulations to Eva.
Yes,
I
and I see it similarly also for coach supervision to bring in the dialectical thinking process.
Okay.
So thank you, Eva.
So I want to conclude here with shedding some light on need press, and I think the questions associated with the social emotional, what should I do and for whom, the cognitive, what can I do and what are my options, and finally the behavioral need press question, how am I doing at this point, which is geared to a specific social and cultural environment. CDF third dimension is based on Henry Murray's work that is on personality, and was used by his student Morris Edelman to create the Need Press questionnaire. In CDF, the psychological profile that is resulting from working with the Need Press questionnaire is, I would say, the glue that holds ED and CD together and determines how they interact. Importantly, while ED and CD regard capability, Need Press represents capacity. That means personal skills, knowledge, habits, temperamental idiosyncrasies. And these are only symptoms that have to be developmentally decoded. Concretely, Need Press or Need Press data show how a person manages their psychogenic internal needs and the pressures exerted upon them. And I will talk about that more. And as I mentioned before, while ED and CD do not really create much insight into the idiosyncrasies of an individual, they are good for billions and millions of people, but not for the individual. Need Press goes down to the level of individuality, and so for and for that reason, I have taught myself to look at social, emotional, and cognitive outcomes through the lens of Need Press, because that's in Need Press. That's where the ED and CD show up. So briefly, Henry Murray distinguishes between needs that are subconsciously held strivings for survival and inclinations to self-protect. And there are two kinds of press or pressures. There is the ideal press that the individual imposes on himself or herself. And there is the actual press that social reality imposes. And so the individual has to deal with two kinds of pressure, his own superego and that of the real world, so-called. Let's go on. So for me, ED, CD, and NP are intrinsically related. I would say that the psychological profile modulates the ED and CD profile in a negative or positive way. And so the learner of CDF, the beginner, has to learn to distinguish what is psychological and what is social emotional. And if you talk with clients, what you hear is a mix of the two. And you cannot use CDF successfully if you cannot decode the psychological profile and the psychological, let's say, psychological babble of the client social emotionally. You need to be able and to learn how to decode, asking the question, what level is that sentence I just heard from my client spoken from? And that has psychological underpinnings, it has cognitive underpinnings, and it has social emotional underpinnings. So knowing CDF, knowing Need Press, to me has been instrumental in fine-tuning my listening, because in consultations in real time, the ED and CD dimension are kind of not in view, whereas the psychological is very much concretely before your eyes. And if you use your own internal conversations, as a psychologist would do, if you use yourself as an instrument of your consultation, listening to clients and discerning, might they be angry? Might they be put off? Might they be hiding something? If that registered in you as a consultant, you can then bring ED and CD tools to bear on that conversation, but not otherwise. So in a sense, then, Need Press for me is the basis of my consultation. And from there, I seek my way to cognitive and social emotional hypotheses. So in short, I think a helper needs to understand the client's psychological profile to gauge cogenic obstacles to personal and professional development, whether ED or CD. Now, as to conflict moves on, let's move on. Henry Murray has been very helpful in spelling out in 18 variables what conflict can mean. If you relate conflict to 3 clusters of traits, namely self-conduct, task focus, and interpersonal perspective, which show up in the questionnaire. So conflicts that people talk about, even organizational conflicts that are not directly personal, the way they are interpreted and treated have to do with these 18 variables. And these 18 variables are defined in Henry Murray in an often unconventional way. So somebody who undergoes or experiences conflict, what could that be? It could be, in terms of need press, any of these 18 things. It could be that the person has an insufficient or overdrawn self-concept, that the person has a bad risk-taking stance, and that they are either afraid or not afraid of what they are doing and the consequences of what they're doing. It has to do with a person's flexibility, namely their ability to deal with novelty, diversity, and to generate alternatives. It also has to do with how they approach tasks, how autonomous they feel in their role, and what is the strength of their drive to achieve, what is their resourcefulness. That will all determine what they experience as conflict. And furthermore, conflict may also be, or may always be, rooted in how well a person is affiliated with others, what their relationship to power is, what their ability to know how they come across to others is, which is grouped under empathy and so forth. So I would counsel people to study Henry Murray's categories simply to learn a vocabulary that can make very fine distinctions between what kind of conflict a person is reporting to you. Let's go on. So in terms of need press, an individual's behavior is the outcome of how their evolving self manages its relationship with a socially pre-structured world. And the outcomes of the questionnaire regard the effectiveness with which an individual manages their own workplace integrity, a measure of psychological self-management. And let's say a person's need press effectiveness index is 40 or 45. It goes into 50 and beyond. That person is in pain. And that pain is not known to the person and not known to the helper before he looks at the need press profile. In contrast to which, if the effectiveness index of a need press questionnaire is 25, the person is doing okay. And if it is 15, they are doing splendidly. And so need press helps you to gauge what is really going on psychologically in the person before you jump into the social, emotional, and the cognitive. And in that sense, we can say that need press modulates social, emotional, and cognitive issues for the person. And the art of using CDF is to strongly including need press, because while many people look down, even Jacques, on psychology, he dismissed it at the end of his life. In my experience, it is an incredibly illuminative dimension to deal with in whatever way. And need press questionnaire for me was always a superb way of doing that. Let's go on.
Otto, we may want to provide the information where the practitioners can sign up for the Need Press questionnaire. That's needpress.com, I believe. And it can be set up by you as the practitioner and also direct a client through that. at a very reasonable cost as well. So that might
Yes,
be interesting
yes.
for you to know how to add this dimension, the third leg of CDF, into your practice very easily to set up and add in. But encouragement is, of course, to become familiar with the science behind, as Otto just mentioned.
Yes, the link to NeedPress is www.needpress.com. And you can go there, ask for your own profile or for your client's profile. And it costs you $1, I think, or maybe now it costs $10. Okay.
$10, yeah.
So let me wrap up to say that for me, the psychological is the bridge or the modulator between the social, emotional, and cognitive. If you really want to get into the experience of a person, you need to approach that person psychologically before you jump into ED and CD. And here is where the individuality of the client lies. This is for billions and this is for millions, but the individuality of the person is here. And so for that reason, actually, in a bracket, I want to add that for me, I have come to the point where personal development and individuation, in the sense of Simondon and so forth, override adult development. Adult development is not the last step. We have to build tools for better insight into how individuation happens. Of the body, of the soul, of the thinking. And that's a whole different issue beyond CDF. But CDF would be a good basis to begin thinking about individuation. That's my view.
Thank you, Otto. In closing this review about the third dimension, we wanted to highlight for you there are the different types of, whether it's coaching, whether it's consultation, whether it's in supervision. When we are coaching for capacity, and we only look at the psychological balance, as Otto did in the last stretch here, we are looking at a horizontal engagement. When we are coaching or supervising or consulting for applied capability, as in performance, and we look at skills, training, interest, a little bit of CD, but we are largely looking at a horizontal intervention. When we are, however, coaching, supervising, consulting for current potential, engaging CD, the cognitive level, using dialectical tools, then we are beginning to go into the vertical component. Same for when we coach, supervise, consult for emergent potential. We are switching CD and ED together. And if we use all three dimensions that we went through this evening, ED, CD, and what we call NeedPress or the psychological, that's when we are fully steeped in the vertical, in the adult development area. So
then thank you very much, Otto. Thank you very much, Ursula. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good time. See you next. So goodbye.
Thank you, Ursula. Thank you all.
Thank you.